Hello, everybody. Welcome to my channel. My name is Margaret Pennard, and I'm delighted you are here today. What do we have on tap for today? Well, it's Sunday in May, so we're going to be diving into the third prompt for the May of the Moderns readathon, which is going to be war. And we've got a special guest today, Brian of Bookish, which makes him sound medieval, but he's not. And we'll be diving into some of the points that he raised that inspired him to write this challenge, which we'll get to in just a second. So in case you don't know and you're just coming here out of the blue, welcome to May of the Moderns Central on my channel. This is a readathon during the month of May this year to highlight books written or published between 1901, when the Victorian era ended, and 1945, when World War II ended. That's just sort of my arbitrary thing, and I'm calling it moderns because that's the most generic term that I could figure that categorized that whole period. And we've got prompts for you on Storygraph. We've got a spreadsheet for buddy reads and or declaring your solo reads. So either way, we'd love to hear what you're doing for May of the Moderns. And without further ado, I guess I'll tell you that we have Friday and Saturday morning reading sprints. So if you're bored and you want to hang out, we're doing 9 a.m. Pacific time to 11, Fridays and Saturdays, reading for May of the Moderns. And now, without further ado, let me introduce my special guest today, Brian, aka Bookish Texan. I came up with this quote to describe his channel. If Kim's channel is a paean to George Eliot, Brian's is the same for Emile Zola, because even his profile picture is Zola. So he started out with a fishing channel, and he just informed me that was called FishTube, but has migrated over to BookTube, which we're very thankful for. His love of books, reading, history, and teaching has dragged him onto the BookTube stage, and he's become quite a vociferous supporter of great causes on that stage, which is great. He's not afraid to jump into controversy. He started a banned books tag, for which there is a playlist, which I will pop into the chat, and I'm going to be doing that on Tuesday. And he donates his ad revenue to charitable causes. So he's like a great all-around community member and has put a lot of thought into his research of history, because he also writes about history. So here we go. Welcome, Brian. Hello, hello.
Hello, Margaret. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's
Great.
Sunday, and I'm excited to talk about war and the first half of the 20th century. How are you doing?
I'm good. Can I start off by correcting the host?
Yes.
It's Balzac, not Zola.
Is it?
Yes, it is.
Oh, okay. I get them confused because they're in the same French course in college. Sorry.
They're both French, and anyway. So sorry.
Both 19th century classics that are big tomes. So
I just didn't want anybody to ask me a question about Zola and me. I've only read Germinal. That's it. So anyway.
All right, good. So now that we're on the right page, thank you. Let's welcome all our people here to say hello. Barrett is here. Anita, Cool Gamer, come in to stop and say hello. And Jim's Books, Reading, and Stuff over in Georgia.
Hello,
Great
everybody.
to see you guys. Hello. Here is Brian's. Wait, did I pull it up? Did I even pull it up? Let's see. I'm going to put these things in the chat as I copy and paste. So bear with me here. Brian's prompt for us to read is read a book, a novel, a memoir, or poems about World War I written by an author who actually fought as a soldier during the war. And before I put it out, and in my introductory video, we qualified that means a combatant or someone who is in the fray, but not necessarily a soldier. Like, do you want to tell us a little bit about that qualification and why you wanted to highlight that difference?
Well, I wanted to highlight that difference because the soldiers themselves in World War I, and particularly those who wrote about it, really felt like they were separate from everybody else, that nobody had experienced what they'd experienced, that nobody knew what they knew. There's actually more of a fraternity probably across, no man's land between Germans and French soldiers and British and German soldiers and so on, of people who'd experienced this really almost indescribably horrible thing. And that they had a tendency picked up on from their writing in their books, that a tendency to kind of be just almost disdainful of people who were like behind the lines, who were like in some kind of administrative capacity, and to feel like that other people who weren't there in the front lines really never understood what it was they went through, and they felt like they had an inability to explain, what they were experiencing. And oftentimes when they were asked, they would, not tell the truth because they didn't think anybody would believe them. That there was that real division then that existed between themselves and other people. Right. So that's why I wanted to make the prompt specific to kind of looking at something a combatant wrote, and then maybe comparing that to something that a non-combatant wrote.
All right. Does it have anything to do with the fact that you might have some like mission or gripe or grudge against someone who possibly got famous without having fought in the war? Just like as a maybe.
I don't have a grudge. I would say that it bothers me when I see, a writer like Hemingway or Faulkner or Dos Passos called a writer who wrote about World War I when their experience of World War I was very different from the experience of other writers, of other people who survived the war, survived actual combat, and came back and wrote. And so it bothers me a little bit, probably of all the books that bother, and I don't think I put this on my list. E.E. Cummings wrote a book called The Enormous Room, which is billed as a World War I novel. And to be honest with you, none of it, he was a POW during World War I, and all of it's about the POW experience in this enormous room that was a prison. And it just doesn't really get to, and he was also an ambulance personnel person. So it doesn't really get to what the experience of the war was like, which is what I was going to get at for this prompt, because am I going too long?
No, you're good.
Because I think that one of the things that is important to understand about World War I is that World War I really changed the direction of modernism. It changed the direction of people's thinking. That it really shifted from, looking at technology as perhaps a positive thing to looking at technology as a potentially nightmarish thing. That because technology was used to such effect in World War I to kill people and in indiscriminate, anonymous, and terrible ways, that it really kind of shattered a lot of people's faith in technology as a solution to problems and a creator of progress.
Right. Have you seen like the I can't remember if it's before or after the war. It must be after. Metropolis, like classic movie.
I saw it one time in college, but I don't really have that much.
Exactly.
So.
I remember. I think it was trying to get at that feeling of like everything breaking apart and like the vision of the future just like being turned into a nightmare. So yeah.
Right. Even Charlie Chaplin's, I think, Modern Times, where he gets stuck in the cogs of the machine. Have you seen? Is a kind of a commentary on technology not necessarily right, not necessarily being a good thing all the time.
Yeah. We've got Seriela Alba is saying, hey, but
Alba.
She's driving, so stay safe there. And Shannon says, make friends with the like button. Thank you. She's about to go and interview her next author for her show, so we'll catch the replay. Nice of you to stop by. What about the fact that you're focusing on the Great War, the First World War, rather than the Second? So from my vantage point, I feel like that's a significant choice because I feel we have a lot more World War II in our history courses in high school. So as a common denominator, as Americans, we know more about World War II and veterans and the path of that war and the sort of characterization of that war than we do about World War I, which is sort of bewildering and not covered as well. So what do you think about that choice?
Well, in part, I chose World War I because of what I mentioned. I think that, we see the aftermath of World War I on the way people thought about things in the 20s, the 30s. We don't really, in the period you've defined as modern period, we don't really see the impact of World War II on society afterwards. And the other thing I would say is that while there were movies being made right after World War I, and there's some, famous silent movies about World War I, World War II is much more of a movie that we consume, much more of a war we consume through movies, I think. That you can think of lots of World War II movies that came out in the 50s and 60s that kind of told that story. And I'm not an expert on World War II novels, but the only one I can think of is, it's the Norman Mailer novel, Naked and the Dead, is probably the most famous World War II novel, I think. written by a combatant, and it's just not
Oh, okay.
it's just not exactly the same.
Yeah.
And so I don't think you could see the impact of the war on the modern period so much from World War II.
All right. That makes sense. Let's see. To your point about, and I'm not catching up on putting my links in the chat like I said I would because I'm listening, but I will do it in a second. To your point about the First World War being so much of a watershed, I have a quote to share from, what is this, University Press of Florida, that I was noodling around in and found very interesting in terms of how the war poets thought of themselves and couldn't really identify with other people writing about the war. Indeed, what is war poetry and when did it come into being? The war poet and war poetry, observed the war writer and veteran Robert Graves in 1942, were terms first used in World War I and perhaps peculiar to it. Of course, poetry has always been interested in combat, from the Iliad and the Battle of Malden to Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade. Such poems were almost always written by civilians, but war poetry as a distinct category and genre emerged in the English-speaking world with the extraordinary outpouring of verse between 1914 and 1918. A late Victorian culture of heroism, the spread of education, the conscription of an enormous number of highly educated men in the army ranks, and a dominant public school ethos meant that there was a flowering of verse both within and beyond the trenches of France and Flanders. So I thought that was really interesting because that speaks to what I like to examine about this, 45-year period, is that you have all these Victorian influences going in. You have all these, I don't say aberrations, but shocks, as the economists will say, to society in different places. And then coming out of the moderns, you're like, is this the same world? Like, we're humans are the same, but the things we take for granted, the norms have changed a lot. So I thought that was really interesting. Do you have anything to say about what might have come into and been the output of those pieces of literature that you mentioned?
So I hope this is on topic. I always think about
not a requirement on my channel.
I always think about the celebrations that went on in European capitals when war was declared, where thousands and thousands of people went in the street to celebrate that they were going to war, and young men signed up in huge numbers for this great patriotic thing, and that was kind of the ethos that existed before World War I. And then they get to World War I, it devolves into trench warfare, into a war of attrition, and all of those ideas they had about heroism really go out the window. All those ideas about, and it's just reflected obviously in some of the more famous poems there, but all of those ideas about what individuals did during war go away because, on a grand scale, on the largest scale ever, for the first time in history, you have people being eliminated, literally ceasing to exist, being blown to pieces by an enemy who's so far away. Not only can't they see them, they couldn't possibly do anything to prevent themselves from being killed. And they end up living in the dirt like animals with animals. They end up dying in such an incredible variety of ways, awful, horrible, unimaginably awful ways, that I think that what emerges then is a group of people are saying all that stuff that was before, that's not the reality anymore. That technology has turned it into this other thing. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you just look at the way wars are fought, World War II was fought very different than World War I to avoid fighting World War I again. You went from like large unit, groups of men charging across open plain to take a specific geographic point, to really small unit actions where soldiers were trained to act as a small unit and to do their one part. And if everybody did their one part, then everything would work out. It's just a completely different. I could probably think of something I tried, but off the top of my head, I can't think of something that's not made different by that experience. And because so many people who fought in the war were so literate, they, like you said, there's literally an outpouring of writing about that experience and sharing that with people afterwards.
Cool. Okay, so now I'm going to go back on the outline since I've got my things in the chat. I just wanted to highlight that I've put the playlist because you did the banned books tag. That is your playlist of banned books. And I'm going to be doing this plus there was 2 you tagged me in. Canterbury Tales. I figure since you're the guest on Sunday, I'm going to do the 2 tags you tagged me in that are sitting waiting for months.
All right.
So
Well, great.
on Tuesday. Yeah. And that is the page that I just quoted it from that I might return to because there's some other interesting points that they made too. So in case you're wondering, and now I can go back on outline. Let's see. So I was talking last week with my friend Bree from Locked Booktition, and we were getting on my word for the period, which is disillusionment. And I just sort of was like gobsmacked by the fact that it means such a different thing to African Americans, because to have disillusionment, you have to have the illusion in the first place. And they were under no illusion that they were treated as second class, third class citizens. And so when I think of that in the context of war, to sort of bring the 2 prompts together, it doesn't really fly. What would you say is different about, we can just stick to America for the first part of the question, but the African-American fighting experience or any processing of that experience in literature? And I've tagged a Claude McKay poem. So go ahead and tell me your thoughts, and then I can read a little of the Claude McKay poem.
I honestly don't know that I can think of a work of an African-American veteran of World War I that reflects that experience. What I would say in terms of disillusionment, I do think African-American men who went to the Western Front to fight were disillusioned, but they were disillusioned about the illusion that had been created in the United States, that everyone treated people of African descent in the way that Americans did. That they went over there and saw a different world where they were just accepted as Americans for the most part, not completely, but accepted as Americans and, allowed to eat wherever they wanted to and to go wherever they wanted to. And they're like, holy crap, you mean the whole world doesn't view us as second class citizens who they deprive of rights and deprive of basic human decency? And I do think that's why we see World War I veterans coming home, African-American World War I veterans coming home and beginning to be more demanding of equality here. And that then runs into trouble. I mean, I'm sure most people are aware that a lot of African-American veterans were actually lynched, or not a lot, but African-American veterans were sometimes actually lynched wearing their World War I uniforms. The violence against African-American veterans in the American South and elsewhere after World War I was not uncommon. And in part, it was to essentially push them back down and stop them from thinking that they had a right to things that, people in the United States didn't want to give a right to.
Right. That's an excellent point. So it was a reverse. Instead of the golden vision of someone's worthiness in the world and the role that they fulfill for everyone being the super soldier, it was we're below everyone in the world, and then realizing that no, that's just the people who we live with who want us to think that, and then coming back to fight for their rights. Yeah.
Right. Which James Baldwin experiences when he goes to Paris in the 50s. This a similar kind of having to reframe the thinking.
Yeah. So I don't think this is much discussed, so I'll just put it out there in case it's education for anybody. But during World War I, it wasn't just Americans and Europeans that were fighting. We did have empires at that point, which is going to be the topic of next Sunday's video. We're going to have Roz of Scally Dandling about the books come on to talk about the end of empire prompt. But because of that history and position of the people, the powers that were fighting, you had a lot of conscripts from around the world. And the same site has a point about this in terms of literature, because you had a lot of South Asians fighting, and you had a lot of North Africans fighting. That's where I get the pied noir, which is the thing that I try not to mix up with the other word that is black feet. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so let's see. To engage with Asian or Arabic poetry of the First World War is thus not just a process of adding to or expanding the conventional repertoire, but involves putting pressure on what constitutes the poetic, as we need to embrace the textual, the oral, and the aural. I'm not sure what the difference is between those, and understand the interplay between them. Second, literary historians of the war often feel a pressure to find an Indian Wilfred Owen or an African Siegfried Sassoon, as if colonial war poetry were a variation or mimicry of British trench poetry. Contexts were actually very different. And then they say, consider one such war poem which includes multiple histories, identities, and conflicts, and see what it does to our understanding of the genre. The West Indian American poet Claude McKay's If We Must Die is often considered as the inaugural address of the Harlem Renaissance. So this page has an excerpt. And I'm not a poetry expert, so I'm sure there's lots of references in this. And this article actually talks about the references that this African-American poet is infusing this poem with, because it's talking to the trench poets, but also talking to like his own people that will understand what it feels like. And this is just the two little pieces. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us still be brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men, we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. And he does it in a sonnet, so it's like a British form, and you're just like, wow, okay, master. Like, it's good stuff. It's good stuff.
Can I just address? I saw Alba pointed out that there was that summer of 1919. I believe that was called Red Summer.
Yep.
In the United States, because of the violence carried out against African Americans, veterans, and otherwise that followed World War One. Because so many African American veterans were coming back, and because African Americans, even in World War One, were able to find their way into industry and other jobs they hadn't been in before, and it looked like progress was being made. And so, of course, the forces of white supremacy come along and attempt to convince them there is going to be no progress by carrying out as much violence they possibly could. Yes.
Yeah.
And hi, Roz.
Yay, Roz is here. See, you say someone's name on a live stream and it conjures them into being. Hello, hello. Oh, good points. Okay. What would you say are stereotypes of World War I fiction? And do they hold up, since you've read probably the most of anyone on BookTube? Well, we'll see. We'll see if anyone comes out of the woodwork.
I don't know that. So this again, I think gets to whether or not I have a grudge or a bone to pick with what we label as World War I fiction or not. But I think what I think that I would point out is there's a difference between a novel, let's say A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway, that uses World War I as a backdrop to essentially a story about a couple and what happens to them, and a novel that is about the experience of being a combatant during World War I. There's kind of there is a significant difference. And so I think what a lot of times people think when they think World War I is they think one of the more novels, they think one of the more famous ones. And then that gives them the impression that what went on at the war, what went on in the war itself maybe isn't really what the point was. And I think those combatants wanted to make sure, whether we're talking about Erich Maria Remarque in All Quiet on the Western Front, which I assume is the World War I novel the most human beings who speak English have read. Could be wrong. But, they wanted to express, something specifically about the war. And sorry, I'm going on. I'm a teacher, so I lecture. I apologize.
Yeah.
So additionally, I think Remarque's novel wasn't published until the 30s. And as you go from close to the war to later in the war, even Remarque's novel is kind of making a point about war in general, which not all the World War I novels necessarily made. Some of them are just, this is what happened, and this was awful, and these bad things happened to these people. And some of them are like, isn't war terrible? Let's look at all the reasons why, kind of a thing. So, but I did just finish reading or listening on audiobook to Under Fire, the story of a squad by Henri Barbusse. And I just finished it. And at the end, it's basically the whole last 30 minutes of the audiobook or dissertation on why war is bad.
Was it part of the book, or was that the author's note?
No, it was part of the book. It was like the last.
I was gonna say, they don't have author's notes back then, so.
No, it was like the last chapter. But that book, I would say if you wanted to read a World War I book, which wasn't All Quiet on the Western Front, which really gives you exactly incredible detail about what the experience was like as a soldier, I would say that novel was really good for that in a big way.
Yeah. Under Fire can be found on Bookshop. I've got links down below if you want to follow and find any of the books that Brian has recommended on Storygraphs. I just put it down below for easy access. So since you brought up a book that you just finished, I'm going to just ping the book that I just finished. And, Roz is giving you full permission here. Lecture to your heart's content. So I read a Persephone book called William and Englishman, and they have great prefaces where they frame the book out of context because it's, from 1917, before the war ended. And it's written by a woman who was a nurse, and she was at the front lines. And so that was an interesting perspective. And it's a story of a couple that is what we would call militant for a cause at home and anti-war protesters, because it's all part of the machine and they're like for suffrage and socialism or whatever. And then they go on a honeymoon. They don't read any newspapers. They're in Belgium. And from one day to the next, they see all these people scurrying around, and they're up on a hike, and they wonder what's happening, but they're not very concerned. They come down and everyone has fled, and they're like, what's happening? And then the Germans come to the little cottage where they're staying for their honeymoon, and, the hell begins. And so that was what she took as her juxtaposition of people who think they know how the world works, thrust into a what do they call it? Stage, or what's the dramatic metaphor people use? Theater of war. Yeah. And so I thought it was quite effective at war imagery, at real life details, at like the fear and the conversion that goes on in someone's, the world is not how I think it is, in the mind of William, who makes it back, and then meets his cohort again of people in meetings who are talking about how the government can't do anything right and this kind of thing. And he just has no patience for it. It was good. It was good. So I'd recommend it. I don't know if you would consider it a war novel, but I mean, yeah.
Again, I guess they're all war novels. If she had experience as a frontline nurse, then, there were people dropping bombs on the place where she was. So I think she counts, or he counts. I think that counts. Just from the Barbusse novel, which I just read, he doesn't make a distinction between those kind of people and himself. He makes a distinction between those people and the clerk who's, a mile and a half behind the trenches.
Here's the interesting thing. She turns William into a character who tries to enlist, but he's too short. So he's turned away twice at the recruiting office in London. And the third time he finally gets in, he trains with his buddies. The buddies protect him because they see he has like a fighting heart. He's not in for very long, and he's humping along, and he faints or whatever because of some heart condition. So then he's put behind the lines, and he's like dying by slow degrees because he knows he wants to be on the front line avenging what happened to him, but he's not qualified. So he's like put in this back office doing telegraph messaging. And
right.
Yeah.
I think Barbusse's characters might have thought of him as a shirker anyway, to be honest with you, but that's probably not fair. And I'm not adopting all of Barbusse's points of view. But his characters probably still would have looked askance at that person, because what he says in his novel is every time they met somebody from the back lines, from behind the lines, a clerk or whatever, somebody involved in something was non-combatant role, that person always said them, I told them, I tried really hard to get into the front lines and into fighting, but they wouldn't let me go for some reason or another. But all sides did get a lot less picky about who they let in the army as time went on, because so many people were dying and being injured.
I know this is a little bit of a hobby horse, and it has nothing to do with the May of the Moderns readathon, but have you read Maisie Dobbs?
No, I have not.
Okay. I know I'm like evangelizing this book because she has some really interesting war scenes as well. And Jacqueline Winspear, writing historical fiction now, obviously not someone who's been in war, but she must have done some good research, because I really liked how she portrayed the war nurse, the war romance, the after effects, the psychology of the veterans returning. Good stuff.
Right. And a lot of stuff like that we know because of the writers who experienced and wrote about it, leave behind a documentary evidence. And I praised David Diop's "At Night All Blood Is Black," which won the international something a couple of years last year, year before last.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a World War I book, and it has that feeling of being in the trenches and the experience and the nightmarish kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I would think books written today could use research to accomplish something very similar.
Yeah. So we did talk a little bit about how books by combatants would be different from non-combatants. Do you have any additional perspectives on women who are writing? Because the William book is written by Cicely Hamilton. She is a woman writing about it. Any experience or thoughts about, I don't know, what those stories would have that would complement or would overlap with the stories of soldiers? Just like theories.
I don't, to be honest with you, I don't know. I'm going to read audiobook A Son at the Front by Edith Wharton. I'm going to start that this week, which is her kind of World War I novel. And Wharton, I think I mentioned this, was in Paris during the war, and she did go to the front lines.
What? I don't remember this when I did my paper on this junior year of high school.
I'm pretty sure. Well, maybe I'm wrong, but I think she did visit troops in what people call the front lines. And here I'm getting nitpicky again. The front line is is where there's not another trench between you and the Germans.
Right.
That's the
it's
front
like
line.
When we're looking at this.
Right.
Yeah.
Behind that, there would be other trenches where the people in front of you were on your side, and behind that there would be another trench where people in front of you were on your side, and behind that there'd just be people hanging out. And so I doubt very seriously, right? I doubt seriously Wharton got all the way up to the front line, but I do know, and I'm pretty sure that she visited with frontline troops who had just been pulled off, and she had I want to say it's kind of a charitable thing where she was trying to make sure that they were provided for and that they were getting the things they needed, because I think she realized that they were not being supplied adequately and they were suffering, and wanted to do something about that. So I'll be interested to see if I'm right about that. I'll be interested to see how that kind of affects her perspective on what she writes about. I do know that that a World War I soldier who came back from World War I and wrote a novel about World War I reviewed A Son at the Front and was not overly complimentary of its realistic view of the experience. So he became a book reviewer in the 1920s, and I believe he reviewed A Son at the Front. He didn't trash it, but at the same time, he was like, it's kind of, not exactly the way things were.
Yeah.
Which of course it wouldn't be.
Right.
So
interesting. All right.
And I would, in terms of the disillusionment, it would spread, kind of like a disease.
Yeah.
If the people on the front lines were disillusioned, that's going to spread backwards. And that same feeling of horror and the nightmare, and certainly nurses and medical personnel would have seen the result of what was going on. And so they would have, they would have been aware. And so I think that their perspective would count in with the perspective of soldiers as well.
Good deal. Yeah, I thought it was interesting that so Cicely Hamilton spent a lot of time setting up the beginning and the mindset of the two characters before they went off on their honeymoon. What formed them, what their careers were based on, how they fell into these causes and decided to adopt them and became militant, and how they called their protests going into battle and adopted all this language that was war language without really understanding what war was. And that you could feel it going in, this is gonna be bad. But yeah, I thought it was well done.
Last year I read Despised and what was it?
Despised and Rejected?
And Rejected by Rose Alatini. And while it doesn't ever actually cover anything that takes place during the war, it does find itself set in the pacifist movement in England, with the main male character being someone who's resisting. I believe, if I remember, he goes to prison for refusing to serve. And it does kind of talk about the different influences and it shows different influences, different people who are a part of that movement and their varying levels of commitment. How committed were you? Would you go under this circumstance? If they threatened you with prison, would you go? How serious were you? But that was a really good book. I liked it a lot.
Yeah, nice. That's another great one in the Persephone catalog. So in William and Englishman, this little short guy who wants to be a soldier, on one of his returns from being rejected from the recruiting office, someone tries to hand him a white feather, And I had never heard about the white feather movement, which is like shaming pacifists into going to fight, until the Maisie Dobbs series. So I was like, oh, okay. So it's interesting.
Yeah.
Like that is the stuff that gets edited out. It's like sort of the propaganda arm that once it served its purpose, the government doesn't want you to know, or the education system doesn't want you to know how it gets its goals met,
Right. And even if you just look at the propaganda, the British war propaganda, about, they kind of reduced the Germans to being like animals or gorillas. And, certainly they just like, oh, well, we just had to do that because it was war. We didn't really dehumanize these people, and, in a way of kind of encouraging people to go fight and kill them.
Right.
But, they certainly
I mean,
did.
the same way we struggle with the Japanese incarceration and
Oh my
sort of
goodness,
have to
yes.
deal with it. Yeah.
Yes. To say something about World War II is, oftentimes we think about World War II in terms of racism because of Nazis and the Holocaust, etc. We sometimes, I think, overlook what I'm going to call racism, even though it's probably a little more subtle than that, of the Japanese and their attitudes towards the other people of Asia and the South Pacific and their treatment of them then. And we really overlook our own racism, particularly towards the Japanese.
Yeah.
Which is, there are reasons why there's some Bugs Bunny cartoons from the 1940s they don't show, because they're horribly racist against the Japanese people. And that all then built into acceptance of things like the internment camps in the United States, which, is disgraceful. And, I think since that's kind of my research writing thing right now is World War II and part of the Pacific, that edge of racism really made the war in the Pacific in lots of ways nastier than the war in Europe, if that's possible for one war kind of to be nastier than the other. But,
right.
Americans took Germans prisoner. Americans really didn't take Japanese soldiers prisoner. And we say it's because they wouldn't surrender. Yeah, okay. But we also didn't really want to take Japanese soldiers prisoner. So anyway.
Interesting. Speaking of your writing, how's it going?
Oh Lord,
I like needling him about it, because every time I give it a comment, he's like, how's the writing project?
I have to be the slowest producer of any kind of manuscript in the history of writing, I think, other than maybe Ralph Ellison. I have it with an editor now, to somebody who's going to edit it for me, and they have obviously they qualified to edit. Also have a background in history and an interest in the subject, and it's with them, and I'm working on creating timelines and making my endnotes now.
Nice.
Since I don't know what kind of publisher that I'm going to seek for it. I don't know how much of that kind of academic stuff will be necessary, but I'm going to go ahead and do it. Which means I'm doing nothing, because I hate that.
Hey, you're preaching to the choir.
Oh, I hate endnotes so much.
Yeah.
And every time I write something that requires the endnotes, I always think, slow down, do a good job. Make sure you make your notes for yourself in the text, so when you go back, you don't have to look up stuff again.
Right. Leave yourself breadcrumbs.
Yeah. There's still stuff I'm like, I don't know where I got
long way around.
Figure it out.
It'll still get done. It's just the long way around. It's all right.
Sure. Yeah. That's what I tell myself.
Yeah. So when you mentioned the cartoons, that, again, sort of a tangent thought, but when we were talking about race last week, Bree was underlining the point that often, to get across a point, a Black author would have to couch something in comedy, and that would be a way to let it go past like the editors or the censoring process or the vetting process or whatever it was that was like being controlled through white supremacy, to get their thoughts and feelings out there in the literature or the music or whatever world creative medium they were adopting. Mm-hmm. And I think it works both ways, right? So if you're getting propaganda out and you want to brainwash people not to like a race of people, you have these horrid cartoons that dehumanize people, and you put that out just for the kids to watch. And you're surprised to see they grow up and they don't like people who are Asian, and you're like, well, okay, it's working both ways. Comedy and cartoons, we need to actually consider, rather than just say, oh, it's not a serious medium. Well, it's still having an effect on your culture, right?
Right. Well, like Al Jolson appeared in blackface,
yeah.
and which is racist in and of itself. And then because he appeared in blackface, he changed his voice to mimic and to demean dialect spoken by Black people in the United States. And he accentuated things about Black people that people thought were funny or that were stereotypical. And that carried on. I mean, sorry, now I'm really on a tangent. That got me started. That carried on. Even think about, if you've ever seen the old Jack Benny show?
Oh,
you know what I'm
probably
talking
listen
about?
to it on like a radio recording.
So his like butler was an African-American person named Rochester, and he speaks it with a stereotypical sounding voice. And a part of the comedy that comes from Rochester is that racist, that racially stereotypical
The difference
stuff.
in diction and whatnot. Yeah.
And then just behavior. And, you know, Rochester is easily, you know, one of the great myths of racism in the United States is that Black people are just easy to scare. And then when you scare them, they behave in ways which appear to be comical, which is just, well, it's just evil. And there's right. And there's so much of that. Even in, sorry, now I'm really on a tangent. even in Huckleberry Finn, even though Jim is clearly the character that Mark Twain wants us to think of as being kind of the moral character, there are scenes that are in the book and some that were cut from the book which play off of those racist stereotypes for comedic effect that have to do with Jim as well.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's not what we're talking about. There you go.
Good discussion though. Ross saying Sassoon took a decade after the end of the war to feel able to write about it in prose, publishing Memoirs of a Fox Hunting Man anonymously. That's an interesting title. I want to look into that. Alba says, embarrassed to say I was never interested in books with a name like Maisie. Now I want to read them. I'm glad I'm converting people in the audience. Roz is agreeing. And then Alba saying, I was just wondering how long it would take for someone who participated in the war to be able to write about it. A decade. Yeah. Jim saying Colette was one of the first women to report from the front lines for Le Matin. Her war reporting was later published as a book, Les Heures Longues. I did not know about that either. I think I just like unhauled the autobiography of Colette because I figured it would be like navel gazing and I wouldn't be able to hack it, but it wasn't this one. So, like others, he did write poetry during the war, and that's a great fact. Thank you, Jim. Brian on tangent. Golden hour.
What else is new?
All good. All good. The next question I had to ask you about was American fiction versus European. So given the output that we do have that's readily available, what is the difference between the literature that we see from Americans and Europeans in general?
In terms of like authors who fought in the war and wrote, the difference has to do with, I think the main difference has to do with the amount of almost the type of horrible things they saw versus the longer you were in the war, the greater variety of nightmares you witnessed, like Barbusse. I mean, he witnessed some stuff, and there's some horrible stuff described in that book. Whereas an American writer, like my favorite American World War I novelist, is a man named Thomas Boyd. And in Through the Wheat, he wrote from an American combatant's point of view. And for an American, he spent a long time in combat. But, the average American was only in combat for a couple of weeks in World War
A couple of weeks?
Yes, because literally hundreds of thousands of Americans who were in uniform didn't get to France. And those who did get to France didn't necessarily get put in the front lines. But Boyd was a Marine, and he was in combat from about November of 1917 till the end of the war, which is a long time for an American. As a matter of fact, the other book I would recommend by an American who wrote about his World War I experiences is a book called Company K by a man named William March. And March and Boyd were actually in two different Marine regiments during World War I, but both were used. They both fought at Belleau Wood. They both fought at, a lot of other battles you can think of that we associate with Americans in World War I. And their experience of combat was of movement. They spent some time in the trenches training, but once the Americans were involved and once sorry to go off on another tangent, once the German offensive of 1918 stalled, in part because of Americans helped stop the Germans from reaching Paris in 1918, once that happened, the Germans' ability to attack essentially went away. And with the increasing number of Americans coming into the lines, Europeans, our allies in the United States, went on the attack. And so Americans experienced a war of movement, or they weren't stuck in trenches for long times, but they were charging across open plains, and they were capturing cities and things like that. And so their perspective is a little bit different, and their experience is a lot different than what a French soldier like Barbusse would have experienced from 1914 to 1915.
Nice.
But nonetheless,
you're making
horrified.
me think of the people who are trying to describe an elephant, and they've all got a different part, and they're blind, but they're describing a different thing because they entered at a different time. It's a different war. You're right.
Right. And so for Americans, it was like that. And it wasn't as much of the grinding, sustaining bombardment for months and weeks at a time. It was more of a, hey, we're not even in a trench. We just got to go to that place over there. And so we're going to charge through all these machine guns and, get there, kind of a thing. And it was that more over and over again that they experienced. So it is different. But in terms of disillusionment, still there. In terms of American soldiers expressing, the writers expressing outrage with the randomness in which people were killed. Like in Boyd's book, he describes a soldier who was laying on the ground, like after eating dinner, being killed because a limb fell off of a tree and hit him in the head and killed him right after the battle. He was like, how can this possibly be, fair? This person survived this horrible thing. He's killed by this random thing. But there is a difference. I'm not exactly sure I described it well, but there's a difference in the feel of the thing.
What you made me think of with that distinction is a certain nation in Europe having a very strange experience in the war, which would be Irish folks. I don't know if you've read anything, but just for a tiny bit of context, the Easter Rising of 1916 happened mid-war. So people who were Irish in British regiments, because they were under colonial rule, were choosing between nationalism and fighting for their home to be a country on its own, and like the evil spreading across Europe and having to make an impossible decision, or already being in the military because they had no other choice to survive and have food to eat, and having that choice made for them. And like, that would be a fascinating thing to read. I think I don't know of any Irish literature about the war. But now I kind of want to seek it out.
Now I kind of want to look for it. Yeah. Yes, that would be an odd. Because they had all these Irish regiments, the Queen's Own Irish Fusiliers or whatever they were, and they were made up entirely of Irish soldiers that had to have been
There's actually another twist in a historical fiction book called The Tainted. I don't know if you saw when I talked about that. I had a buddy read with someone about that a couple months ago for the Irish readathon. And it was fascinating because it's an Irish regiment that's working for the British Raj in 1920 in India. So you've got a colonial outpost, and the people are the underclass of a different colonial outpost, and they've had the rising and the reactionary backlash, but now they're in another place, like dealing with the racism there. And it was just so multi-layered and so interesting to think about what that psyche would be doing in that situation. That was really a good one.
I would just think that even just for Irish soldiers serving in, mixed units of Irish and English soldiers, I'm not sure how much that was common during World War I, that with the Easter Uprising, surely their comrades looked at them as potential traitors. Because certainly that's the English government's message about, the Easter Uprising, the people who led that they were, stabbing England in the back in the middle of, this cataclysmic war, overlooking the fact, of course, the Irish didn't want to be English, or British, I should say.
Yeah, British. So Nia was stopping by to say hello. Jim recommended The Long, Long Way by Sebastian Barry, which I have heard of before, maybe by Jim. He says it's a great book about the Irish experience, so that's great. Recent publication. Okay. So that makes sense. And I'll be just saying thanks for the recommendation. Good deal. Okay, so American and European, and we got off on a tangent, completely fine. You had made a point about war-adjacent novels by famous Americans, which prompted what I said at the beginning of this about a grudge. Do you think that those novels set out with a certain purpose, and do you think they were achieved, irregardless of the fact that they weren't communicating the real experience according to some? And we're getting close to the end of the hour here, so if anyone has questions, I'll just remind you to pop them in the chat so we can address them before we finish.
What I would say is that a writer like Hemingway or Faulkner, who uses the war as backdrop, as the war as like perhaps a catalyst for a different story they would tell, I would, and this is going to sound awful, I would classify them as trying to create a work of art that is that's trying to do something separate than to describe the horrors of war.
Okay.
That they had a different artistic purpose. A lot of American writers, I would say, who wrote novels about the war were not great writers. You know, they were only modern in the sense of what they discussed, which, by the way, is an important part of modernism that comes about in part because of World War One, kind of freeing up what could be published and what, you know, but they're more just like granular. Here's what happened, and this is this bad thing, and this is what it looks like when somebody gets blown up, and that kind of thing. Whereas, you know, Hemingway, and they're more like, hey, you know, this is how horrible war is, and look what it does to these people. But really, the story is about these people and how it affects their lives after the war, not so much how the war affected their life during the war. If that makes sense.
I feel like you get a lot of the word sublime coming out of this, because it's like people not being able to process the horror, and so they just like detach, or whatever that process is called, where you float above yourself and observe things so that you don't have to deal with the trauma. And I'm like, relatable, right?
Strangely, so give another plug to my favorite World War I novel by an American, Through the Wheat. At the end of Through the Wheat, the main character actually is kind of clearly suffering from some kind of shell shock. He's left behind his machine gun. And even though the Germans are like popping up right in front of him, he just kind of wanders aimlessly out into the field to pick up his machine gun, and has that kind of outer body experience. And since I wrote about Thomas Boyd, the author, originally, the line describing his main character's feeling, his state of mind in that scene was he was Gethsemane, that he was like, you know, taken to another level, like Jesus on the cross kind of a thing. So,
well, Gethsemane was the garden when he was praying beforehand, right?
Oh, sorry. I was thinking about, that he was like in that state of, I guess, awareness where you're going to die is what I should have said.
Oh,
awareness
okay.
where you're going to die, and you don't, I don't know. But it was interesting language. That isn't what wound up in the book. It's the book ends up saying the soul of Hicks, that's the main character, was numb. That's the last line of the book. So
yeah,
sorry.
Thank you, Alba.
More tangents.
I knew it started with a D. Thank you. Dissociation. Yes. And Jenna, the soul writer, stopped by. Been listening in while lurking, loving the conversation. Back to chores, author catch up, family time while lurking. Yay, take care of yourself and hit the like button. Sweet. What makes, this is sort of incorporating or wrapping up all your previous points, what makes a good World War I novel for you? And this can be novel written in the period, maybe it's a separate novel written in the period contemporaneously, and historical fiction written about it, because that's what I'm curious about as a historical fiction writer.
Well, I haven't read a lot of historical fiction written well afterwards, you know, set during World War I. So for me, and this is just as basic gets, and because I think my background is history, the more realistic and the more real to life and the more firsthand knowledge the author brings, the better the World War I novel is for me. And in this case, it'll be one of those cases where the writing to me matters less than the verisimilitude of what they're writing, the truth of what they're writing, and that really comes through. Because one, you know, as a historian, my interest in World War I is initially as somebody who's interested in history. That's where it is. And then, you know, when I was in grad school, I did a research thing about historical accuracy in World War I fiction to kind of tie the two together. And so I think I still have that mindset that I'm looking for that thing that says
you don't
the one
say.
that's the most accurate.
Is that a dissertation that's like online, or is it still typewritten in some folder?
I can't remember how long it was, but I don't think I have a copy of it any longer.
Okay.
But it does speak speaks directly to this topic that we're on, which is really why I wrote the prompt the way I did.
Yeah. Nice. I mean, if you had a copy of it or whatever, I would love to read that, because that'd be interesting. Let's see. Q&A. Q&A. I don't think we had any questions. So, did you have anything that like tugged loose that came out during the discussion that you wanted to embroider upon?
I think I chased all those rabbits.
Okay.
What I would say is plug through the wheat third time. It's out of copyright now. It was published in 1923. You might be able to find, you should be able to find it online for free. Project Gutenberg or someplace like that should have it. And, you should be able to find really cheap e-copies or even print on demand copies soon.
Okay.
So it is something that's not copyright protected any longer.
Oh, okay.
By the way, thinking about American World War I fiction writers, E. Cummings was first with The Enormous Room, which, as I mentioned, isn't really about World War I at all. It's more of a psychological study of people who were POWs. Okay. Then Dos Passos wrote Three Soldiers, and I think published that in 1921. He was an ambulance corps person serving on the Western Front in France, and then transferred to Italy. But that novel has a little bit more of the frontline stuff, but it's still more about a psychological look at the characters themselves. And then there were other novels, of course, but then Through the Wheat was published in 1923. And it really was, I think, Boyd really was the first American combatant to try to convey through his work what the war was actually like for American soldiers. And then there was, after Through the Wheat, there was kind of an explosion of books by combatant writers, most of them completely forgettable. And then Hollywood started picking up and writing scripts based on those, and not necessarily always crediting the author, but making amalgam scripts based on those. And that you started seeing World War I silent movies come out. Big Parade is probably the most famous
Talkies.
one. There was that one. That one wasn't a talkie, but yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. So when you were saying like the wave of what was acceptable to publish came out, and then people who weren't really excelling at writing started publishing these things, that sort of is what I was trying to get at when I was asking about stereotypes of World War I fiction. Is that to me, looking back on that period, what comes to mind, I mean, this is probably more World War II, but when I think of war fiction, I suppose if I'm going to be more specific or accurate, is like the pulpy novel, the mass market paperback that's not very big, that's got some lurid cartoon color on the front, and like it's gonna be for young boys who are reading, and it's gonna be a little propaganda-y because it's gonna glorify war. Oh, and I almost forgot. So one of the things I looked at my bookshelf and I found this because I was looking for other things to talk about war. Seize the Fire, Heroism, Duty, and the Battle of Trafalgar by Adam Nicholson. And I've read another of his books, and I haven't read this one. But just his introduction talks about that, refers back to that first quote that I read about what was coming in from Victorian into World War I that influenced the way the literature went. And he's talking about how 18th century, you had sort of Enlightenment rationalism. 19th century, you had all this nationalism whipped up again. And so you go in with this vision of glorifying war and violence, and that illusion, I think, is what we were thinking it might be called, before it comes crashing down and you've got people down on war again. So it kind of goes in this kind of cycle, right?
Right.
So,
and American soldiers thought they would go over, they'd win. They thought just like those American soldiers had many of the same thoughts that, the French and German and British soldiers had in 1914, American soldiers had in 1917, 1918. And, they ran into the reality of, the anonymity of the war, and then killing and death and things like that as well. So I would say in the beginning, in the 1920s, the American writers who wrote about World War I were not trying to glorify war, but I do know that some of them, because they had to make a living, did start writing things for pulps that were less down on war and more glorification, or they
writing to market. We know that battle well. Any authors listening in?
or they became communists. Some of them did that too.
Yeah,
going a completely different direction.
And let me just put in the chat here the other link that I found. So when I was trying to find some intersectionality between the prompts, I was looking at writers of color, like I mentioned, and war literature. And there's this one that is a book riot compilation that the first two are writers of color, but they're modern looking back, and they're piecing together the soldiers who were Black and South Asian, American and European theaters, and describing their experience and what it was. So I'd recommend checking that link out if you want to get a little further afield from the main well-known ones.
There weren't a lot of African American units which were allowed into combat. Mostly, this is also still somewhat true of World War II. Mostly they served as like rear echelon stevedores, loading and longshoremen and things like that, and truck drivers and things. But there were units like that. I can't remember the name of the one I was going to mention, but there are combat units made up of African American soldiers, that fought in combat as well.
Yeah. So, yeah, that was an interesting thing for me to learn, that they would sign up and they would ship out, and then they would be assigned to loading or docks or cleanup, or latrine duty is the one that you would think of. Stuff like that, because that's the American value system. And then, as we said, the illusion got turned upside down because they were treated as normal people, citizens, without the rights of anyone else in places like France. And so
that racist idea that African American men made bad soldiers because they weren't brave, which, where the hell did that even come from, other than racist convenient mythology? Right. That carried over into World War I and even into World War II. So that their function was oftentimes logistics and not combat.
And just to bring in another complete tangent, I just watched the tribute to Trevor Noah's gran, because his grandmother just passed away, and he put a bunch of clips together about like his time with her down in South Africa. And he had one clip that was like, there's an expression in South Africa, which is, you hit a woman, you hit a rock. It's just that, like, they're that strong and you're that ineffective. So don't even try it.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, that seems a little closer to the truth. So, Roz is saying, I've read so much World War I poetry and so little prose by combatants. Remarque, Sassoon, Graves only, I think. Now I'm intrigued. Yeah, so check out the Book Riot link that has two, not prose by combatants of the time, but I think that would be incorporated into the modern studies about that, because they're academic folks putting those together. Alba says, same here, except not even poetry about war ever interested me. I don't know. You read something, for me at least, the one big headliner is the Dulci et decorum est pro patria mori, and those have kicker lines. Those are very effective in terms of emotional appeal, even at the remove of history and at the non-understanding of the actual causes of war and all that stuff. So there are, and I don't know who that's by. Is that Wilfred Owen? I think it is. Get my facts straight here.
I'm gonna let Roz answer that.
Okay. Roz is also highlighting Vera Brittain and May Sinclair as volunteer nurses. Yes. Vera Brittain's Testament of Youth is the one that comes to mind. Alba says, I know, I cried all the way through Trevor's tribute. Oh, someone else just saw it too. Yeah, okay. There we go.
Thanks, Roz.
Okay. Yeah. Fact checker in the audience, always helpful.
I would also say American World War I fiction is more racist than European World War I fiction. That you'll find Boyd and other American writers resorting to stereotypes of African Americans that were commonly in the United States. And I found that European writers are a little bit less likely to comment on, particularly, and this is just awful, but Americans had a tendency to talk about how bad they smelled and just kind of stereotypically talk about just things like, it's just, anyway, things like that. And then even just like with Vietnamese, the French army brought Vietnamese soldiers to France. Primarily, they were driving trucks, driving soldiers back and forth. And sometimes it drove Americans who had racist things to say about the Vietnamese drivers as well, because, well, America.
Oh, Maggie, hello, penumbra mine. She's also mentioning the mentality that war was like Vegas. What happens in war stays in war. So Brian actually mentioned earlier that might be related to the fact that the war fraternity of soldiers figured that no one else would understand what they went through. So it was often not talked about.
There's a great scene in Under Fire where the group of soldiers from the squad are in Paris on leave, and they see a tableau where there's a guy in a French military uniform, and there's a German guy surrendering, and there's this whole crowd standing around watching, and they walk up to look at it too, and they're disgusted by what it shows because it's not real at all. But when somebody in the crowd says, you've been at the front, you guys are the real heroes, is this really what it's like? And they just say, yeah, sure.
Wow.
Even though, and then they feel bad about lying, but they didn't think it'd be possible.
What is the truth going to cost them who've already paid so much anyway?
Right.
Yeah.
And I think they felt like nobody would believe them if they told them anyway. So, what's the point?
Yeah. Well, we're over our hour. I was watching and then it just sort of crept by. So I want to say thank you to everyone for coming and chatting and bringing up such great points and recommendations. And I hope you enjoyed this talk. Thank you to Brian for coming on, talking about your prompts, giving us a lot of education on the topic. Just a reminder what's happening next on the channel. I'll be doing double tags this Tag Tuesday. Brian's tagged me in banned books and Canterbury Tales. So that is what is coming up. And we've got those reading sprints Friday and Saturday morning at 9 a.m. Pacific. Sina actually came out of retirement to pop by on last Saturdays, which was fun. So I got to see an old friend. And yeah, let me know how you're doing on your buddy reads, or enjoying the prompts, or enjoying the readathon in the comments below. And we'll see you again next week when Roz is our featured guest to talk about At the End of Empire prompt.
Yay!
Yay! So thanks everybody, and talk to you again soon. Bye.
Bye.